The thermometer outside the sheriff's office in the town of Redemption read 4 degrees below zero. Wind drove ice crystals sideways down the muddy, frozen street. Inside, Sheriff Brody watched the glass. It was the 3rd day of the deep cold, the kind that found every crack in a cabin wall, every gap in a chinked log. It was a cold that killed livestock where they stood and settled deep in the bones of men. He pulled on a second pair of gloves. 2 families had already sent for the doctor, their children shivering with fevers that burned in rooms where a man could see his own breath. The town was failing its test. And that made him think of the girl. The orphan on Crowbone Ridge. He told her it was madness. Everyone had. An 18-year-old girl, cast out from the state home with $9 and a dog, buying a rock overhang from a known fugitive. He saddled his horse, the animal's breath pluming in thick, panicked clouds. The ride up the ridge was a battle against the wind. It stole the warmth from his heavy coat, turning his face to a numb mask. He expected to find a tragedy. He expected to find her and the dog frozen solid in their stone tomb, a grim duty to be performed. He crested the last rise and saw it. The shelter was set back into the hillside, a dark mouth in the pale, snow-dusted rock. There was no sign of struggle. No desperate debris. Just a low wall of stone, a patch of canvas where a door should be, and from a crude but functional chimney, a thin, steady plume of smoke rising straight up into the violent air. The wind, he noted, seemed to be flowing over the top of the rock face, leaving the area directly in front of the shelter strangely still. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow. He didn't call out. He walked to the canvas flap and stopped. There was no draft. He could feel, through the thick hide of his gloves, a faint, impossible warmth radiating from the stones of the low wall. Tucked into a crevice near the entrance was a small thermometer, just like the one in town. His own read below zero. Hers read 41 degrees. He pulled the canvas aside. The air inside didn't rush out to meet the cold. It was calm. Rowan was sitting on a low stool by a small, contained fire, mending a tear in a piece of cloth. Her German shepherd, Lupin, was asleep on a flat stone near the hearth, not shivering or whining, but breathing deeply. The space was not a furnace, but it was survivably, impossibly warm. She looked up, her expression unreadable. She did not seem surprised, or afraid. She simply watched him, her hand still. Brody let the canvas fall. He stood there for a long moment in the biting cold, staring at the number on the thermometer, then at the quiet curl of smoke. The place should have been a grave. Instead, it was a home. For months earlier, she had arrived in Redemption with the heat of late summer clinging to her worn dress. Rowan stepped off the wagon with a small sack over her shoulder and a lean German shepherd at her heel. The matron of the orphanage had given her a final, thin-lipped lecture on the sin of idleness and pressed $9 into her hand. The world has no place for sentiment, the woman had said. Make your own way or perish. Redemption was a small, hard town carved into the foot of the mountains. Its people were wary, their kindness worn thin by harsh seasons and isolation. Rowan asked for work. She was offered laundry, mending, a room in the back of the saloon. All of it felt like a cage, another institution with different walls. She listened more than she spoke. She heard the whispers in the general store, the talk over beer at the saloon. They spoke of Crowbone Ridge, and the man who lived there, a recluse named Nash who was wanted for something no one could quite remember. They said he lived in a hole in the rock like an animal. They said he was leaving, heading for the territories where the law was even thinner. She found him packing a single mule behind the blacksmith's shop. He was older than the stories suggested, his face a roadmap of hard sun and harder choices. He watched her approach, his hand resting near a pistol on his hip. Lupin stood beside her, silent and watchful. "I hear you're leaving the ridge," she said. Her voice was steady, without tremor. He grunted, cinching a strap. "What of it?" "I hear you have a shelter there." He stopped his work and looked at her properly for the first time. He saw a girl, but one without the usual softness. Her eyes were direct. "It ain't for sale. Ain't mine to sell. "It's just rock. I have $9, she said, holding out the worn bills. "Sell me your claim to it." A dry, rasping sound came from his throat that might have been a laugh. He looked from the money to her dog, then back to her face. He saw the finality in her gaze. She wasn't asking for charity, she was making a transaction. "It's a hole in the ground, girl. The wind'll cut you in two come winter. You'd be better off in a town ditch for $9, she repeated. He stared at the money for a long time. It was nothing. But it was also an ending. He tore a piece of paper from a tattered ledger, dipped a pencil stub in his mouth, and scrawled a few words. "I, Nash, cede my place on Crowbone Ridge to the girl for the sum of $9. He signed it and handed it to her. He took the money without counting it and stuffed it in his pocket. "The dog's smart," he said, nodding at Lupin. "Trust him more than you trust people." Then he turned, led his mule away, and didn't look back. In the general store, when she bought a shovel head, a small axe, and a sack of salt, the owner, Mr. Hemlock, saw the paper. "You paid for that?" he asked, his voice thick with derision. "Nash Pigsty? Child, you've bought your own tombstone." The climb to the shelter was steep. Lupin ranged ahead, his nose to the ground, then circled back as if to ensure she was still following. The path was little more than a game trail. The air grew thinner, cleaner. And then she saw it. It wasn't a cave, not really. It was a massive, south-facing limestone overhang scooped out of the mountainside by millennia of wind and water. It formed a wide, crescent-shaped space, perhaps 40 feet across and 20 feet deep at its center. The rock ceiling was high, stained black in one corner from old fires. The floor was uneven, littered with fallen rock, animal droppings, and the detritus of Nash's solitary existence. At the very back of the main alcove was a smaller, darker opening, a true cave that receded into the hillside. Rowan dropped her sack. For the first 2 days, she did nothing but watch. She sat on a rock at the edge of the overhang from sunrise to sunset. Lupin lay at her feet, his ears twitching, cataloguing the sounds of the ridge. She didn't look at the mess. She looked at the system. She watched the sun's arc, noting how the light filled the space for most of the day, striking the back wall directly. She crumbled the rock in her hands, feeling its density. At dusk, she placed her palm against the stone wall that had been in shadow all day, then against the back wall that had been in the sun. The difference was stark. One was cold. The other held a deep, resonant warmth. This was the heart of it. The stone was a battery for the sun. She took out a small, cheap notebook and a pencil stub, the last of her purchases. On the first page, she drew a rough sketch of the overhang. She marked the direction of the prevailing wind, which seemed to come from the northwest, striking the main body of the mountain and flowing up and over the shelter, not into it. She made a note, "Wind goes over. Not in." The first task was brutal, physical labor. She used the shovel head, hafted with a sturdy branch, to clear the floor. She moved tons of rock and soil, bucket by bucket, dumping it over the edge of the ledge. She scraped away the filth until she was down to the bare stone floor. It took her a week. Her hands, soft from the orphanage laundry, were blistered, then calloused. Every muscle ached. While she worked, Lupin hunted, bringing back rabbits and squirrels, which she skinned and cooked over a small, open fire, eating every part. She was not just cleaning a space, she was understanding it, learning its dimensions and its geology with her hands and back. The ground had to be level. The foundation for survival had to be solid. Heat was the primary equation. A simple fire pit like Nash's was inefficient and dangerous, the smoke would choke her out. She needed to control the fire, to direct its energy. She needed a fireplace and, more importantly, a chimney. She'd seen them in pictures in books at the orphanage, diagrams of heat flow and air currents. She remembered one design in particular, a shallow firebox with angled sides meant to throw heat out into the room, not up the flue. She spent the next 3 weeks gathering stones. The creek at the bottom of the ridge was full of them, worn smooth and flat by the water. Each one was a decision. Too round, and it wouldn't stack. Too heavy, and she couldn't carry it. She made dozens of trips a day, a canvas sling over her shoulder, her legs and back straining with the effort. Lupin often accompanied her, a silent, watchful companion on the trail. She piled the stones near the shelter, sorting them by size and shape. For mortar, she needed clay. She found a rich deposit near the creek, a thick, grey seam in the earth. She dug it out with her hands and the shovel, carrying it back in buckets. She mixed it with sand from the creek bed and dried grasses she shredded by hand, kneading the mixture with her bare feet until it had the consistency of thick dough. This was knowledge she didn't know she had, an instinct for earth and water and fire. She chose a spot for the fireplace against the western rock wall of the alcove, where it would get the morning sun but be sheltered from the main wind channel. She laid the foundation first, a heavy, flat slab of stone. Then, slowly, course by course, the structure began to rise. She built the firebox shallow and wide. The sides, the covings, were angled precisely, not by measurement but by eye, by the memory of the drawing. She was building a machine for warmth. The chimney was the most difficult part. It had to be tall enough to clear the overhang and create a proper draft, and it had to be stable. She built it thick at the base, tapering it as it rose. She packed her clay mortar into every crevice, smoothing it with her wet hands until the joints were sealed tight. It was slow, painstaking work. From the valley below, a man out hunting might see her, a small figure moving back and forth on the ridge, piling rocks. It would look like a child's game, a fool's errand. They couldn't see the logic. They couldn't see the precise angles of the firebox, or the careful construction of the flue. They saw a desperate girl playing with mud and stone, and they shook their heads, certain of her fate. When it was done, she let the clay dry for 4 days in the autumn sun. Then, with a small bundle of dry twigs, she lit the first fire. The smoke hesitated for a moment, then caught the draft and streamed up and out of the chimney. A wave of radiant heat, far greater than any open fire could produce, washed over her. Lupin, who had been watching from a distance, came closer and lay down on the stone floor before the hearth, sighing as the warmth sank into his fur. Autumn air grew a sharper edge. The sun's arc was lower, its warmth less potent. The nights were cold enough to frost the ground. The open front of the overhang was a gaping vulnerability. She needed a wall. Lumber was an expense she could not afford, and felling a tree with her small axe was a task beyond her strength. So she turned again to the mountain. She began building a low wall, no more than 4 feet high, across the front of the shelter, connecting the 2 arms of the crescent-shaped rock. It was a dry stack wall, built without mortar, relying on the careful placement and weight of the stones for stability. It was a windbreak, not a fortress. The work was familiar now, her body accustomed to the rhythm of lifting and placing. She left a narrow gap for a door and a smaller, square opening for a window. For these, she used what she could barter. Rowan had spent weeks gathering herbs from the mountainside, yarrow for fevers, plantain for wounds, elderflower for coughs. She dried them carefully and took them to town. The doctor, a practical man named Alistair, was impressed by their quality. He gave her a few dollars and, more importantly, 2 large, sturdy canvas sacks that had once held medical supplies. She sewed them together with an awl and sinew she traded for, creating a heavy flap for the doorway. A peddler passing through sold her a roll of oilcloth for the window, a translucent material that would let in light but keep out the wind. Food was the other pressing concern. She used the deep, dark cave at the back of the shelter as her pantry. The temperature there was constant, a cool 50 degrees, insulated by tons of earth and rock. She foraged relentlessly. She gathered acorns and leached the tannins from them in the creek, grinding the meal into a coarse flour. She dug for cattail roots and wild onions. She picked the last of the season's berries and laid them out on flat rocks to dry in the sun until they were hard and sweet as pebbles. The creek provided a steady supply of trout, which she gutted and smoked over a low, smouldering fire of green alder wood, then packed in the salt she had bought. She bartered with a farmer on the far side of the valley, trading a week's labor, mending fences and clearing brush, for 2 sacks of potatoes and 1 of carrots. Back at the shelter, she dug 2 pits into the earthen floor of the cold cave. She lined them with flat stones, filled them with the root vegetables, and covered them with more stone slabs, creating a simple but effective root cellar, safe from frost and rodents. Her home was a system of interlocking preparations. The fireplace for heat. The wall for wind. The cave for food. Each element supported the others. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning. The temperature began to drop steadily. In Redemption, the mood superinter. The coming winter was a shared adversary. Talk in the general store turned to the orphan on the ridge. Mr. Hemlock, holding court near the pot-bellied stove, was grimly satisfied. Pridefulness, he declared to the men gathered around. She refused a place at the boarding house. Refused good Christian charity. The charity he spoke of had been a cot in a drafty attic in exchange for 16 hours of labor a day. The mountain will teach her a lesson she won't live to repeat. She'll be frozen solid by Christmas. No one argued the point. It seemed a self-evident truth. A girl alone could not survive a winter on Crowbone Ridge. Sheriff Brody heard the talk and felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. She was not in his jurisdiction, not truly, but she was in his conscience. He had a daughter her age. One afternoon, as a steel-grey sky threatened more snow, he rode out. He told himself it was to check a trap line, but he knew it was for her. He didn't ride all the way to the shelter. He stopped on an adjacent rise, where he could see her encampment through the sparse trees. He saw the low stone wall, the taut canvas door. And he saw the smoke. It was not the billowing, wasteful smoke of an open fire. It was a thin, efficient ribbon rising from the stone chimney. It spoke of a hot, well-drawing fire, a fire under control. He watched for nearly an hour. He saw her emerge once, carrying a bucket, to collect snow from a clean drift. She moved with purpose, without wasted motion. She did not look cold. Her dog was not pacing or whining. Brody turned his horse back toward town, a seed of doubt planted in his mind. What he had seen did not align with the town's certainty. It didn't look like a tomb. It looked like a hearth. He didn't mention his trip to anyone. When Hemlock asked if he intended to retrieve the body before the wolves do, Brody just looked at him. "The girl is still alive," he said, his voice flat. The statement, devoid of any other detail, hung in the air, a small crack in the foundation of their shared assumptions. The men around the stove looked at each other. It was not the answer they had expected. The real winter arrived not as a storm, but as an occupying force. A blizzard buried the valley under 2 feet of snow, and then the sky cleared, leaving behind a brittle, punishing cold. The temperature plunged and stayed there. The wind was a constant, malevolent presence, scouring heat from everything it touched. In Redemption, the season's toll began. The town's hastily built wooden structures were no match for the sustained assault. Cold seeped through walls, around window frames, and up through floorboards. The rhythm of life slowed to the feeding of stoves. Firewood, stacked high in autumn, dwindled at an alarming rate. Sickness followed the cold. The doctor's buggy was a constant sight, moving slowly through the snow-choked streets. It was a battle of attrition, and the town was losing. On Crowbone Ridge, the system Rowan had built was being tested. Outside, the wind howled, a physical blow against the mountain. But it flowed over her shelter, the main force of it broken by the massive rock formation above. The low stone wall she had built deflected the ground-level currents, creating a pocket of still air around her entrance. Inside, the laws of thermodynamics were her allies. The fire in her carefully constructed fireplace burned hot and steady. It did not have to fight drafts. The heat radiated outwards, striking the immense stone walls and floor. The limestone, with its high thermal mass, absorbed the energy all day long. When the fire burned down to embers at night, the stone began to release that stored warmth back into the small space. It was a slow, gentle, persistent heat. The deep earth of the cave behind her acted as a massive insulator, its temperature a constant that pulled the shelter's average temperature up. Her thermometer, hanging on an interior wall away from the fire, never dropped below 40 degrees. Rowan moved with the quiet efficiency born of necessity. She ate the food she had stored. She mended her clothes. She kept the fire fed, but not raging. It was a partnership with the stone. Lupin was the true barometer. He did not huddle by the fire, desperate for warmth. He slept soundly on the hearthstone, or sometimes on her cot, his body relaxed. He showed no signs of stress or cold. He was content. This was the proof. An animal does not lie about comfort. The numbers in her notebook confirmed it. Each day she recorded the outside temperature and the inside temperature. Outside, -5, -10, -7. Inside, 42, 40, 41. The gap between the town's reality and hers was growing with every degree the thermometer dropped. The crisis came to the Carver family on the 5th night of the deep freeze. Their cabin, built by the creek, was old and drafty. They had run low on firewood, forced to burn green, sappy pine that gave more smoke than heat. Their youngest, a boy of 6, had fallen ill. A fever raged, but his hands and feet were like ice. He shivered violently in his cot, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The doctor was miles away, in town, tending to 3 other families. John Carver, the boy's father, was a quiet man, not given to panic. But as he watched his son's lips turn a bluish color, a desperate thought took hold. He remembered the talk about the orphaned girl, the fool on the ridge. He'd scoffed along with the others. But he also remembered seeing the smoke from her chimney, steady and calm in the wind. Folly or not, she had a fire. Pulling on his worn coat, he told his wife he was going for more wood, a lie to spare her the foolishness of his real mission. The walk up the ridge was a brutal ascent. The wind cut through his clothes, and the snow was deep and crusted. He fell twice, his hands raw and numb. He was fueled by a desperate, illogical hope. He expected to find a miserable hovel, a girl shivering over a pathetic, smoky fire. He would beg for a few burning logs. When he finally reached the shelter, he stopped, breathless as much from shock as from the climb. The stillness was the first thing he noticed. The absence of wind. Then the sight of the low wall, the neat chimney, the canvas door that did not flap or shudder. It looked solid. Permanent. He raised a numb hand and knocked on the wooden frame of the doorway. The canvas was pulled aside. The girl stood there, her silhouette framed by the soft light of the fire within. She simply looked at him. And then he felt it. Not a blast of heat, but a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to sink right through his frozen coat and into his skin. He stepped inside, and the world changed. The wind was gone. The air was still and warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. He saw the efficient fireplace, the neat stacks of wood, the organized shelves carved into the rock. It was cleaner and more orderly than his own home. He stared, unable to form words. He looked at Rowan, then at the sleeping dog, then at the impossible comfort of the room. "My boy," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking. "He's so cold." "The fire, we don't have enough wood." Rowan listened without expression. She looked at the man's chapped face and the desperation in his eyes. She turned not to her woodpile, but to her hearth. Several smooth, flat stones were resting there, away from the direct flames but soaking in the radiant heat. She had been using them to keep her own bed warm at night. She took 2 of the largest stones, testing their temperature with a knowing hand. They were deeply, thoroughly hot. She wrapped them in thick pieces of scrap wool, tying the bundles securely with twine. She then went to a small shelf carved into the rock wall, where bundles of dried herbs hung. She selected one, a mix of yarrow and elderflower, and handed it to him along with the stone bundles. "Put these in the bed," she said. Her voice was quiet, factual. "By his feet. Under the blankets. When they cool, heat your own stones by your fire and swap them." She held out the herbs. "Make a tea with this." A small cup to John Carver stared at the objects in his hands. Hot rocks. Weeds. It seemed like a peasant's remedy, a fool's cure. He had come for firewood, for a real solution. But the undeniable warmth of the stones in his hands was a powerful argument. The radiant heat was already seeping through his gloves, bringing feeling back to his numb fingers. He looked around the shelter again, at the quiet competence of it all. This was not a place of foolishness. He started, wanting to thank her, to ask how, but the words wouldn't come. Go, she said, her gaze already turning back toward her fire. It was not a dismissal, but a statement of urgency. His son was waiting. He stumbled back out into the brutal cold, clutching the warm stones to his chest like a treasure. The journey down was faster, driven by a new kind of hope. He burst into his cabin. The change in temperature from her shelter to his was sickening. He pushed the warm stones deep into his son's cot. The boy flinched at first, then, as the deep, gentle heat began to permeate the blankets, his violent shivering began to subside. His breathing seemed to ease. An hour later, his wife brought him a cup of the tea. The boy drank it. By morning, his fever had dropped, and the blue tint was gone from his lips. The story spread through Redemption not as a dramatic tale of rescue, but as a series of plain, verifiable facts. John Carver got hot stones from the Orphan. The stones stayed warm for hours. The boy got better. The simplicity of it was confounding. It was Sheriff Brody who acted on it. He rode up to the ridge again, but this time he brought Mr. Hemlock with him, insisting the man see for himself. They stood inside the shelter, their hats in their hands. The warmth was undeniable. Hemlock, the loudest skeptic, was silent. He ran a hand over the interior stone wall of the fireplace. It was radiating heat like a living thing. He touched the low wall near the entrance. It was cool, but not the biting, frost-laced cold of the stone foundation of his own store. His eyes fell on Rowan's notebook, left open on a stool. It was filled with columns of numbers, dates, times, temperatures inside and out, and crude drawings of wind patterns. Brody pointed at the pages. These numbers? He began, trailing off. Rowan, who had been feeding a single log into the fire, looked over. The stone holds the heat, she said, her voice even. The sun helps during the day. The fire helps at night. The wind goes over, not through. It was the most they had ever heard her say. Hemlock looked from the notebook to the chimney, his mind slowly processing the elegant physics of the place. He had seen it as a whole. He had failed to see it as a system. I was wrong, he said, the words quiet and heavy in the warm, still air. The great cold broke in late February. The Chinook winds returned, and the snow began to melt, turning the streets of Redemption to thick mud. Spring arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a messy, necessary thaw. With it came a change in the town's perception of Crowbone Ridge. The path to Rowan's shelter, once a desperate route for a single father, became a trail of cautious curiosity. They came not with baskets of charity, but with questions. A farmer, having lost half his flock in a poorly insulated barn, came and stood for an hour just looking at her dry stack wall, running his hand over the interlocking stones. No mortar, he said to himself, marveling at how it blocked the wind. Two brothers who owned the sawmill came and studied her chimney, tapping the clay mixture with their knuckles. It draws clean, one of them noted. No smoke in the room. They asked about the clay, where she found it, how she mixed it. Rowan didn't lecture. She didn't explain the principles of thermal mass or passive solar design. She simply let them look. She would point to the clay deposit by the creek. She showed them how the stones of her hearth held heat long after the fire was low. The knowledge was there to be seen, to be touched. It was proven by the simple fact of her survival. Mr. Hemlock, humbled and intrigued, was seen the following week examining his own store's fireplace, a large, inefficient iron box that consumed wood and gave little warmth. He was spotted with a plumb line and a measuring tape, looking at the angle of its flue, a frown of concentration on his face. The Carver family came, not with desperation, but with a gift. John Carver carried a heavy sack of flour on his shoulder, and his son, now healthy and robust, walked beside him. They left it by her door. No words were needed. Rowan continued her work. The shelter was not a finished project, but an evolving one. With the money she earned from selling more herbs and expertly tanned rabbit pelts, she bought 2 small panes of glass from the peddler. She carefully replaced the oilcloth in her window, setting the glass in a frame of wood and sealing it with more of her clay mortar. For the first time, she had a clear, unobstructed view of the valley below. The work was constant. Reinforcing the wall, gathering wood for the next winter, tending to her small, growing patch of herbs. Lupin, her constant shadow, would lie for hours on the sun-drenched stone ledge, a living testament to the comfort and security she had built from nothing. The shelter on Crowbone Ridge was no longer Nash's hole, the outlaw's hideout. It was not the orphan's tomb. It was a home built not with money or brute force, but with observation, patience, and a deep understanding of the world as it was. The knowledge she had demonstrated began to spread through the community, not as a sermon, but as a seed, planted in the fertile ground of a hard-won winter. It was in the way a man now looked at a south-facing hill, in the way a woman placed a stone near her cookstove to warm a bed. It was a quiet, practical wisdom, spreading invisibly from a single, steady plume of smoke on the high ridge.